key in it, but I ain't gonna charge you.
Barney, what do you mean you're handing in your resignation?
Just what I said. I'm handing in my resignation. One tie clip. One tie.
Well, now, hold just a minute now. Before I accept your resignation, I got to have a little explanation here. Now, just ease back and tell me what's got into it.
Well, this is the last straw, Andy. It's bad enough there ain't any deputying for me to do, but I don't like to be teased about it.
You was teased?
That's right, and by your own son, Opie.
Well, what happened?
I seen him do it. I caught him red-handed.
What did we do?
You don't believe it, do you? Well, I didn't think you would. One cat.
Now, wait a minute. I am bound to hear this. Now, tell me, what did Opie do?
He wrote a poem about me on the wall of the bank.
Well, what poem?
I wrote it down. I'd like to offer this as foolproof evidence. There once was a deputy called Five who carried a gun and a knife. The gun was all dusted, the knife was all rusty because he never caught a crook in his life. Now that's undermining the dignity of the law. It makes out like I never wanted to catch crooks. And that's just being so. I'd catch him in a minute. But how am I going to catch him in a minute? If only somebody would just commit a crime. What crime? If only somebody just kill somebody. Hey, I don't mean anybody we know. Well, a couple of strangers was to come into town, and well, if one of them was going to kill the other one anyways, you might just as well do a cheer.
Maybe we ought to advertise.
That's right. Make jokes about it. Make jokes about it.
What I'm trying to tell you.
Hi,
Oh, hi, Opie.
Now you can just go ahead and ask him for yourself.
All right. Opie, Barney says there was a poem written on the wall of the bank and that you were standing along beside of it with a piece of chalk in your hand.
Yeah, but I didn't do it, Paul. Honest.
I believe you.
Are you pitting your crime detective judgment against mine?
Well, Barney, I have to. Because for one thing, Opie wouldn't lie to me.
All that evidence.
And for another, he ain't learned how to write yet.
What's that got to do with? You know how to. One flashlight.
The rest is on YouTube if you want to look it up. How do you handle discouragement? On more than one occasion, Barney turned in his resignation to Andy because he did not handle discouragement very well. People quit when they're discouraged. Some will try to run away. Others may drown their sorrows. So the question really is, how do you handle discouragement? Reminds me of the story of Olin Hendricks. He desperately wanted to be a missionary to Africa. There was just one problem. His wife had no ambition about moving to Africa. Her idea of roughing it was sleeping in a Motel 6 instead of the Hilton, okay? That was her idea of being rough. So she didn't want to live in a foreign country. So try as he may, he could not even consider her to try and consider going onto the mission field. Finally, however, he did convince her to take a tour of Africa. Of course, his hope that she would fall in love with the continent, fall in love with the people, and would want to move there to do some missions work. But to his dismay, she was unhappy at every step, every turn. She complained about everything that was going on. Then he tried to inspire her and encouraging her by telling her the best is yet to come. The last few days are going to be the best. Because towards the end of their journey, they were going to Victoria Falls, some of the most natural, beautiful scenes in all of Africa. Look at this picture here of one of them here. That's one of the pictures of this natural waterfall. And then let's go to this next picture here. Beautiful. And he thought that if she saw this, she would be ready to move to Africa. But it wasn't just the waterfall that was going to catch her attention. There's also a statue there of David Livingstone. Look at this statue here. Now, that may not seem like a big deal, but David Livingstone was the first Christian missionary to go to Africa. And he was successful. It was called the Dark Continent at that time because nobody had gone into its interior. Nobody had successfully gone in and come out with a report. David Livingstone did. And he converted a lot of the tribes to be Christians. He just was really phenomenal at his work there. And you can see in this particular statue, you can see him peering out towards the rest of the continent, seeing where he could continue his pursuit of sharing Christ. And so Olin Hendricks believed that if his wife was able to see Victoria Falls and see the statue, she would be so inspired, she would want to be a missionary to Africa as well. So his wife and him got to the falls. They got to the statue, and she looked at it, contemplated it in silence for several minutes. And he decided to pursue the conversation one more time. And so he began simply by saying, "What do you imagine David Livingstone is thinking about?" And she thought about it for a minute and said, "I think he's thinking about, I've had it up to here with Africa." And then they went home. There are situations that make you say, "I've had it up to here." I bet you've had situations that make you say, "I've had it up to here." And if I could get taller, I would. And say, "I've had it up to here." Maybe you've been disgusted with your spouse. "I've had it up to here." Your job, your family, your church, your work situation. We've all had experiences that made us say, "We've had it up to here." We've all had situations that lead us to be discouraged, and we want to call it quits. We've all experienced it from a time or another. And there's a loss of enthusiasm for our responsibilities in life when we face discouragement. And we have a sense of despair for the future. It's never going to get better. It's only going to get worse. When that happens, we're vulnerable to making poor judgments in our life. But even more seriously than that, we're vulnerable to making poor decisions about our relationship with God. Maybe we'll give up on God, or quit believing in God. Or if there is a God, we think He doesn't like us very much, and we get disgusted with God. That's why the Bible tells us never grow weary in doing good, for at the right time God will provide a harvest. Never grow weary in doing good. When we become discouraged, it is imperative that we persevere, because in the end, our work for Jesus Christ is all that's going to matter in life. It doesn't really matter how well you maintained the home. It doesn't really matter how well you did certain jobs and work ethic. Yes, we can honor Christ by what we do. But what we do for Jesus is the most important thing in life that will matter, and it is that which will test, that Christ will test with fire at the end of our lives. The life story of Joseph is an inspiration to us all, that we can be faithful when we are discouraged. Here's Dad, he had it up to here with Egypt. I've had enough. He had it up to here with people. He could have quit. Yet Joseph remained faithful in the most trying of circumstances that would have broken most people. And I want to look at the experiences that produced discouragement in Joseph's life. Joseph, for the first 30 years of his life, could have been severely depressed because his life was on a roller coaster. He was hated by his brothers because he was his father's favorite. They beat him and intended to kill him, but instead sold him as a slave to Egypt. In a matter of hours, Joseph went from the pampered son of a wealthy father to the slave of the chief of executioners in Egypt, known as Potiphar. He didn't deserve that. He was an innocent 17-year-old boy. Once in Egypt, Joseph worked hard. Instead of becoming bitter, he set out to be the best slave that he could be. His master Potiphar noticed Joseph's diligence, promoted him to run the entire house. At this point, as a slave, Joseph is doing about as well as he could, experiencing the most freedoms he could ever hope to in his condition. And so let's pick up the story there in Genesis 39. So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. With Joseph there, he didn't worry about a thing except what kind of food to eat. Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man, and Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. "Come and sleep with me," she demanded, but Joseph refused. "Look," he told her, "my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He has held nothing back from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God." So she kept putting pressure on Joseph day after day, but he refused to sleep with her, and he kept out of her way as much as possible. So Joseph resisted her advances. He repressed his own desires and tried to avoid her. But one day Joseph ended up at the house the same time as she did when no one else was around, and she grabbed him by the coat and demanded they go to bed. But Joseph fled so quickly that she ripped his coat off. And she was so angry, she waited until her husband got home and falsely accused Joseph of rape, and he was thrown into the king's prison. Psalm 105 describes these conditions in verses 17 and 18. He sent someone to Egypt ahead of him, Joseph, who had been sold as a slave. They bruised his feet with fetters and placed his neck in an iron collar. His feet are chained together. His neck has an iron clasp that's most likely chained to a wall. You couldn't get much lower than Joseph at this point in his life. And you would expect Joseph to cry out to God, God, what was the deal? That's exactly what Job did when life turned around. He said, God, I don't know why you're allowing this to happen. When I get to heaven, I'm going to ask you some questions. Joseph never does that. Joseph could have said, God, is this the way you reward the righteous? I never did anything wrong, at least not to this level. What's up with all the dreams you gave me as a child that I would rule over my family? You'd expect Joseph to withdraw from God at this point, and not one of us would blame him. You'd also expect Joseph to withdraw from people, not just God, but people in general. You've heard the old saying, hurt me once, shame on you, hurt me twice, shame on me. And you'd expect Joseph to build a shell around himself. His brothers hurt him, his master's wife hurt him. You'd think Joseph would have just had it with people at this point. You'd also expect Joseph to be bitter. A normal person may turn to drugs or alcohol or even contemplate suicide, but to face prison when wrongfully accused, or to just face prison even if you're rightfully accused, can be the most challenging situation many people ever face. For example, the man in the picture here in an Ohio courtroom, Jason Bickenwitz, 42 years old, and he was led out of the courtroom by a deputy on Friday, August 26th of this year, after he was found guilty of a crime, and he was going to be spending 3 years in prison. On his way out, they were on the third floor. He hurled himself over the banister of the stairwell after freeing himself from the deputies and fell to his death 3 stories below. Now, the sheriff reports that they tried grabbing him, but they were only able to grab his clothes, and as he fell over, the deputy was liable to go over with him, so they let him go. Pronounced dead at the scene. He was guilty of attempted murder and felony assault charges when he shot a man in the face, and he was sentenced to 13 years in prison. The threat of prison can break people even if they deserve to go there. Joseph didn't deserve to go there, yet when he went to prison, he went there faithfully. And let's see how Joseph remained faithful today. It began when Joseph maintained a sense of responsibility. When Joseph was in Potiphar's house as a slave, he took his job seriously and became overseer of the entire household. The text says when Joseph was in charge, Potiphar didn't worry about anything except the food that he ate. He was a model slave. And now he's in prison, doesn't belong there, and yet he becomes a model prisoner. Joseph just gobbled up responsibility and took on more and more. It was the kind of man every leader wants to have at his disposal. After Joseph was in prison, it says the warden took his seat and didn't concern himself with anything that Joseph oversaw. Joseph made his life really easy. Secondly, Joseph was sensitive to other people. Let's go to chapter 40, beginning in verse 1. Sometime later, Potiphar's chief cupbearer and chief baker offended their royal master. Pharaoh became angry at these 2 officials, and he put them in prison where Joseph was, in the palace of the captain of the guard. They remained in prison for quite some time, and the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, who looked after them. Now, we're not sure why these men were thrown into prison, but they were. Bob Russell suggests that one, that maybe Pharaoh had been accidentally poisoned, not enough to kill him, but hurt him, and so he took the 2 people who would have been responsible for that and threw them into prison. Or secondly, maybe they tried to put him on a health food diet, and he threw him in prison. So we're not sure what led to it, but he threw him in prison all the same. Their jobs were simple. The chief baker was in charge of overseeing the food that was prepared to make sure it wasn't poison, and the chief cupbearer was the wine taster. If this was Pharaoh's cup right here, he takes a drink, and if he doesn't die, Pharaoh gets to drink it. If he dies, they get a new cupbearer. And so that's their job. They get poisoned instead of Pharaoh. Could be a high turnover rate at that point, but that was their job. In any case, both men end up in prison, and both had bad dreams. And they were very different from the dreams today. It wasn't like, man, that was a nightmare. These were very vivid. There was something about them that stood out. They knew there was meaning behind them. And we find out it was a message from God after all. And so we pick it up in verse 6, right after we're told they had dreams. When Joseph saw them the next morning, he noticed they both looked upset. Why do you look so worried today? He asked them. Now this is really interesting. Joseph is a slave, then he's a prisoner. He doesn't deserve either one. And he says, why are you down in the dumps? What's your problem? Would you ever have a good day if you were in Joseph's situation? Would you ever be upbeat and say, what a beautiful day. This cinder block prison looks wonderful. I mean, come on. You expect Joseph to be brooding and sitting in the corner. When most of us would say, leave me alone, I got enough problems of my own. Joseph is saying, hey dude, what's your problem? It's a beautiful day. How can I help you? Joseph was sensitive to the needs of other people. The third way we see Joseph as faithful is he consistently testifies about God. Genesis 40, beginning in verse 8. They replied, we both had dreams last night, but no one can tell us what they mean. Interpreting dreams is God's business, Joseph replied. Go ahead and tell me your dreams. Now notice what Joseph doesn't say. He doesn't say, well, I can interpret dreams. He says God can. Joseph doesn't get puffed up about his own abilities. He doesn't get puffed up with pride. He doesn't brag about himself. Well, when I was a kid, I had special dreams and I knew what they mean. Joseph consistently testifies about God. When God sent Joseph ahead to Egypt, Joseph didn't understand what was going on. But he put his faith in God anyway. Back at Potiphar's house, when Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him, notice why Joseph told her no, if you recall. He said he didn't want to disrespect his master, who had trusted him with everything in his household. But then he says it would be a great sin against God. Joseph was concerned about offending God more than anything else. As a slave in Egypt, he could have left God in the cistern that his brothers threw him in. As a slave, as a prisoner, he could have forgotten all about God. But Joseph never forgot God. And maybe that's the key to real faithfulness in our lives, is to never forget God. Joseph didn't take credit for what God could do. Joseph admitted he didn't understand. But he never walked away from God. Later, Jesus would tell us to when we let our light shine before men, it's that they would see our good deeds. It's that all praise would go to God. Even in prison, Joseph was able to consistently testify about God, and all praise go to him. So let's pick it up here. He responds first to the cupbearer. Genesis 40, beginning in verse 12. This is what the dream means, Joseph said. The 3 branches represent 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift you up and restore you to your position as the chief cupbearer. And please remember me and do me a favor when things go well for you. Mention me to Pharaoh so he can let me out of this place. For I was kidnapped from my homeland, the land of the Hebrews, and now I'm here in prison, and I did nothing to deserve it. Notice that Joseph says he doesn't belong in prison. Joseph doesn't say, well, God wants me to stay here, so I'm going to stay here. He knows he doesn't belong in prison. He wants to be free. He's making the best of a bad situation. He's taking his responsibility seriously. But he says, the first chance I have to get out of this place, I'm out of here. And so he tells the cupbearer, remember me and get me out of here. And then there's the baker. His dream was not so pleasant. We're not going to read through it all, but it simply is interpreted as, in 3 days, you're going to die. Now, if you were Joseph, how would you handle letting the baker know that he was going to die? Wouldn't you be tempted not to tell him the bad news? Wouldn't you say, well, that's a little tricky. It might take me 3 or 4 days to interpret this. I'll get back to you. And in the meantime, don't take any long-term life insurance out on yourself, okay? I mean, you'd be tempted to do that. We don't like to share bad news. It can be a challenge. It's like the lady very wealthy lady, hired a biographer to write her ancestry and the stories of each person in her family tree. And so the biographer was doing a good job. And then he came across her grandfather, who she knew nothing about. Her grandfather had apparently been in Sing Sing prison and was electrocuted in the electric chair. And he wanted to write the truth in a way that the black spot wouldn't stand out so much. And so he wrote it down this way. Her grandfather occupied a chair of electricity at one of America's most noted institutions. He was very much attached to his position, and his death was a real shock. Whenever you have bad news, it's tempting to couch it in such a way as not to make it feel so bad. You can feel that you would rather avoid the topic altogether. So what are some ways I can do to make this less painful? Well, you know what? I think when we have bad news, it's always good to find a way to be less painful when sharing it. But at some point, you just got to share that bad news. And maybe, what's the bad news we have to share? Maybe we have to cancel. You're supposed to go out with someone Saturday and you got to cancel. I like how this person came up with a way to let them know they couldn't make it. I mean, who cares that you can't make it Saturday? There's a hole in your house now. And so that's a good way to share bad news in a less painful way. Very clever. Bad news is never fun. That's the reality. That's why it's called bad. But sometimes it just simply needs to be said. Lovingly, but it needs to be said. Joseph told the baker, you got 3 days to live. We're not told the extent of the conversation after that, but I'm sure he told him, get your life right with God. You don't have long left. All right, the fourth way that Joseph shows his faithfulness is he refused to quit. You can only take so many setbacks before you've had enough. Pharaoh celebrated his birthday 3 days after Joseph interpreted the dreams. The cupbearer was restored to his position, and the chief baker was executed just like Joseph had said. Going to verse 23. Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, however, forgot all about Joseph, never giving him another thought. The one long shot Joseph had to get out of prison where he didn't belong was lost. Isn't it amazing how long we can remember how we've been offended, but how quickly we can forget a favor? It's like the favor never happened. The cupbearer forgot lowly Joseph in prison. And then the very next verse happens in Genesis 41, verse 1. 2 full years later. You think this would be the breaking point for most people? This would be the straw that broke the camel's back. Remember, there was no Bible written at this point. You know, Joseph didn't have a Gideon's Bible on his dresser drawer in the prison where he could read it out and say, oh, look what happens in 2 years. I'm going to be the chief administrator over all of Egypt. It'd been nice, you know, but he didn't. For all he knew, he would be imprisoned the rest of his life, wrongfully imprisoned. And in spite of all those reasons for discouragement, Joseph held on. He was listening and he was learning. He was learning about Egyptian culture. And when God would tap him on the shoulder, he was still walking close enough to God to feel God's hand at work. Paul Harvey once gave a definition of success, and he said it's the person who gets back up one more time than they get knocked down. Eugene Peterson's paraphrase of 2 Corinthians chapter 4 to read this way. We've been surrounded and battered by troubles, but we're not demoralized. We're not sure what to do, but we know that God knows what to do. We've been spiritually terrorized, but God hasn't left our side. We've been thrown down, but we haven't broken. Joseph's example of faithfulness ought to inspire us whenever we face discouragement. And there are 3 lessons I want to learn from his example. Number 1, when you're discouraged, keep working. When you're discouraged, keep working. Joseph kept working and fulfilled his assignments to the best of his ability. Whenever you face discouragement, the temptation is to call in sick, pull the covers over your head, go to the golf course instead of the office, show up late, leave early. But that only compounds the problem. You feel guilty and you're discouraged even more. When dealing with discouragement, you need to force yourself to keep going through the motions of everyday life. Maintain those responsibilities. You may not like it, you may not feel like it, but you do it. Sometimes he told me a couple times about the 50-year-old man who was sleeping in bed. His mother came in one morning and said, it's time to wake up and go to church. Pulled the covers off his head, and he pulled the covers back over. He said, no, I'm not going. She opened the blinds, pulled the covers back again, and said, come on, son, it's time to go to bed. Time to go to church. Why do you think you don't want to go? He said, I'll give you 2 reasons why I don't want to go. 1, the people don't like me, and 2, I don't like them. And his mother said, well, I'm going to give you 2 reasons why you're going to go. Number 1, it's Sunday morning, and number 2, you're the preacher. Sometimes we want to just give up our responsibilities. If you're a teacher, those students, you know, they just drive you nuts. That's it. I'm calling into them. I'm calling into sub. I've had it. If you work in an office and people are always bickering, that's it. Taking a vacation day, I'm going to go fishing. I'm going to go to the mall. I'm going to get out of this mess. Sometimes it's hard to fulfill our responsibilities when we face discouragement. But we need to press on anyway. William James once said, if you act the way you wish you felt, you'll eventually feel the way you act. Your situation may not be conducive to a happy attitude, but if you want to feel happy, you start acting happy now, and you'll eventually start to feel that way. So don't allow yourself to be controlled by temporary feelings. You can't control your feelings, let's be fair about it, but you can control your behavior. You can control your attitude. Christians should have a buoyant attitude that allows us to positively affect our circumstances, no matter how discouraging they can be. Second lesson, when you're discouraged, encourage someone. When you're discouraged, you need to encourage someone. When Joseph was in prison, he looked for people who needed a boost. He saw 2 prisoners in need and he helped them. When you face discouragement, you need to reach out and help someone. We often think we need a pity party. We need someone to look at us and nurse us and care for us. I'm in no shape to help one. I need someone to help me. But it is amazing how effective it is to get your mind off of your own discouragement and your own problems and reach out to someone else and make a difference in their life. Dr. William Stigen was suffering from depression many years ago, and a wise counselor gave him some advice. He gave him an assignment. Go find someone who needs encouragement and encourage them. Stigen forced himself to sit down and write a thank you note to an old teacher who gave him a lifelong love of literature. It wasn't a fancy note. It was just very simple. Thank you for teaching me to appreciate prose and poetry. Well, a few days later, he received a note in the mail, and here's what it said. Dear Willie, when I read your letter, I was blinded with tears. For I remembered you as a little fellow in class, and it warmed my old heart. I've taught school for 50 years, and yours is the first letter of thanks I ever received from a student. I shall cherish it until the day I die. Steigen was so moved by that letter, he thought of someone else he wanted to write a letter of encouragement to. And within a few days, within a week, he had written 500 notes to people he wanted to encourage. People he wanted to share his gratitude with. And it completely cured him of his depression. Now, you might need professional help, as William Steigen did, to get through your discouraging time. That's okay. That's why they're there. But if you want to do something to get out of your pity party, it's help someone else who's in real need. If you really want to get better, look for someone to encourage. I love what 2 Corinthians 1:4 says, when Paul says, Christ comforts us in all our troubles, so we can comfort others. When they are troubled, we'll be able to give them the same comfort God has given us. God softens us in our trouble so we can be sensitive to the needs of others when they face discouragement. Third and finally this morning, when you're discouraged, totally trust God. Joseph believed somehow God was going to work it all out. God was going to see him safely through. The cupbearer let him down. Potiphar let him down. His brothers let him down. His father let him down. But God was there. Joseph knew God somehow would see him safely through. God's timing was difficult. God's methods were challenging. But Joseph knew that the Lord was by his side, his sister, in the prison. And as we'll see next week, in the palace. When life gets challenging, we often ask the question, why, God? Why me? Why is this? And those are appropriate questions. It's natural and it's okay. But we have to graduate beyond those questions at some point. Sometimes it's going to take leaving this life and on to the next before we get our answers. And so we need to graduate beyond. Some people months and years later are asking, why God? Why God? It's time to move to the next question. What now, God? What do you want me to do now, God? What's next in my life? Joseph had to ask, what now? And he trusted God would work it out. And God did. It was back in 1981. There was a minor league pitcher named Dave Dravecky. He was challenged by a teammate, Brian Ballard, to open up the Bible and find out who Jesus really is. David spent that summer with 6 other ball players trying to find out the answer. And in 1981, on August 27th, he and his wife attended the Paramount Christian Church in Amarillo, Texas, where Roy Wheeler preached. And Roy Wheeler was preaching on the Lordship of Christ that morning. And both David and his wife came forward and were baptized into Christ. In his biography, Dave says that he was born in Youngstown, Ohio. He was born in Amarillo, Texas. He went on to offer that same chance of making him read the Bible, find out who Jesus really is, and he would offer that to teammates all the time. Well, in 1982, the following year, Dave was called up to the major leagues to pitch for the next several years for the San Diego Padres as one of their very effective left-handed starters. But in 1987, he was traded to the San Francisco Giants. He went from the last place team to the first place team. Oh, and he was good. He was considered the staff ace. He was so good that year he faced the Cardinals in the playoffs, and in 2 starts, he gave up 1 run. The guy was on fire. In 1988, it was expected this would be his breakout season. He was going to make a difference. But they found a tumor on his pitching arm. Now, he was a lefty. I'm not first going to stand in the way. Let's just go with this arm. And they found a tumor on his deltoid muscle, which is the shoulder muscle that goes into the bicep and tricep region. And they had to cut out half of the muscle in order to remove the tumor. And then they also froze the bones that were in there to try to, the bones right below the collarbone, in order to try to kill the cancerous cells. That he was told he'd never pitch again. But Dave refused to accept that. And the following year, in 1989, Dave was pitching in the minors. On August 10th, he made his major league return, going 8 innings for the win. 5 days later, he was in Montreal, Canada, getting ready for his second start. The nation was on fire for Dave Dravecky. And Bob Nepper was a fellow left-handed pitcher for the San Francisco Giants that year. And they were talking about the amazing comeback at lunch, 2 hours before the game was to start. And here's the conversation. It's in Dave's own words, and I'd like to read it for you. Bob told me, "I hate to burst your bubble, man, but it's not the miracle of the comeback that's so important. It's the miracle of salvation. It's the day that you met Jesus that is so important in all of this. What God has done is give you a platform through baseball to share his love with all those around. 5 hours later, in the 6th inning, Dave threw a pitch that caused the bone below his shoulder to snap, and it was so loud it could be heard throughout the entire stadium. He collapsed to the ground, and he had to be carried off the field. But he said, as soon as he hit the ground and that pain shot through his arm, he said the first thought that came to his mind was Bob's words before the game started. God has given you a platform through baseball to share his love to all those around. Dave found out that cancer had returned. He had to retire, and after 2 more surgeries, he ended up having his left arm, shoulder, and part of his collarbone amputated. Dave is today an author and motivational speaker. In his book, When You Can't Come Back, he wrote this: "My arm caught the attention of the entire school. When as a teenager I pitched my first no-hitter, and later my ability to provide for my family was not based on how smart I was or how hard I worked. It was based solely on what my arm could do on game day. When people talked with me, it was the center of conversation. How's your arm today, Dave? Is your arm ready for tonight? My arm to me was the hands to a concert pianist. It was what a feet are to a marathon runner. It's what made me valuable. It's what gave me worth in the eyes of the world. Then suddenly, my arm was gone." In an interview with Barbara Walters, she asked him, "Dave, why did God allow this to happen to you?" And he said, "I don't know." And he said later he realized what the answer was, and he wished he would have shared it. He wished he would have said, "Why not me?" We can all take a horrible experience and grow from it. Listening to his testimony, you think, man, Dave grew through this. And he went through it about as smoothly as anybody could, but Dave admitted he needed 30 months of counseling to get through this ordeal. 30 months. 2.5 years. I'm here to tell you today, you don't have to face discouragement alone. Dave is a great motivational speaker. He's led so many people to Jesus in baseball fans, little kids. He is doing an amazing job, and he's still going strong to this day. But he didn't get through it alone. He had the support of his wife, support of a counselor for 30 months, his church, many others supporting him every step of the way. Joseph looked alone as a slave. He looked alone as a prisoner. But he had God. And God promises, never will he leave you, and never will he forsake you. When you're discouraged, remember that our hope is in the risen Savior. We all have seasons of discouragement, but we find God will guide us safely through them if we will trust him. This morning for invitation, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to watch a worship song. The words will be on the screen, but I want you to just stay seated. I want you to focus on these words. I want you to think about them so that when you go through seasons of discouragement, whether it's right now or it's in the future, realize you can never walk the road of discouragement